So I was looking around for something sad to start with. And there came to my mind a story that Lou Holtz told, years and years ago. It deserves to be retold, and it's a good introduction. It's something very sad. It's about 3 drunks who were on the 30th floor of a New York hotel when the elevator broke down. And they came in about 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, and the manager said, "I don't want to send you men up to the 30th floor." He said, "The elevator's broken. We have cots here. And we put them in the mezzanine. You can sleep there for the night." The first drunk said, "No, we want to go to our room." The first 10 floors, the first drunk said, "I'll sing." And the second one said, "And for the next 10 floors, I will tell funny stories." And the third one said, "And for the last 10, I will tell sad stories." So up they started. First 10 floors, the first man sang. Next 10 floors, the next man told funny stories. They got to the 20th floor. They said to the third man, "All right, begin your sad stories." He said, "I forgot the key." Now, there is actually a melancholic, despairing mood in modern civilization, and we're going to analyze it tonight, partly from literature and partly from philosophy. I wonder if a symbol of it, for example, is not putting safety belts on pleasure automobiles. It's just a tiny little thing, but people are looking for disaster. I wonder if they go on a ship, if they look for the lifeboats instead of looking for the cabins. Remember 30 years ago, those of you who will admit you're old enough to remember 30 years ago? You remember it was an optimistic age. H.G. Wells was writing, and he was saying that thanks to evolution, thanks to progress, thanks to science, there will be no more war, no more death, no more disease. But within the lifetime of Wells, the pendulum swung to the other extreme. We were saying at the end of World War I, this was the war to end all wars. And then came the despair and the melancholy. And H.G. Wells, in his Anatomy of Frustration, said, "As I look before me, I can see nothing but death and disaster and catastrophe awaiting man." He who wrote about the caveman, saying that he would one day reach up his hands into the stars, ended by speaking of a man in a cave, in escape from bombs. That's the way our world has traveled in thought within 30 years. Literature is full of that mood of despair. Now let us try to analyze it and break it down into the 3 steps toward melancholy. The first is egotism. That's step number 1. The second is an uneasy conscience, which begets a hatred of goodness. And the third step is a preoccupation with death, leading also sometimes to suicide. Now the first, egotism. Here by egotism we do not mean selfishness. It's something more than that. It's rather the affirmation of modern man that he is his own law, his own standard of truth, his own standard of goodness, and his own standard of virtue. He denies all objectivity. That is to say, anything outside of himself that might in any way determine him. He denies, for example, music. It is almost like denying music outside of the piano. He decides which note is right and which note is wrong. He is his own yardstick. And this egotism, and this making of the man who is relative, the absolute, and the unconditioned, was forecast by a great Russian writer of the last century, Dostoevsky. And over 100 years ago, Dostoevsky spoke of what he called a plague of Asia that would sweep over Europe and all over the world. And this is the way he wrote 100 years ago. Never before had men thought themselves so clever. Never before had they believed so unshakably in their own wisdom as did these creatures. Dostoevsky said that there was a germ that affected their intellect and their will, not their body, that made them believe that they were absolute and supreme. They became convinced of their own infallibility. Whole cities and whole nations caught the infection and behaved like madmen. Everybody was in a state of high excitement. Nobody understood anybody else. Each man thought that he alone was in possession of truth. He was deeply distressed, beating his breast, weeping and wringing his hands at the sight of his fellows. Nobody knew on whom judgment should be passed, or what sort of judgment it should be. No two people could agree as to what was good or what was bad, who should be prosecuted, or who should be acquitted. In the city's alarm signals were given all day long. Everyone answered summons to mass meetings. But who summoned them? For what purpose? Nobody knew. Ordinary trades were abandoned because everyone had his own suggestions for improving them, and no two people could agree on anything. That was the disease that Dostoevsky said would take over the 20th century. And one finds it in a writer like Sartre, the French dramatist and philosopher, who said, "What is opposite me is none-me. What is none-me is nothingness. My neighbor is hell. I am the absolute." I was reading the other day a citation from a German philosopher who said, "If it could be mathematically proven and established that God existed, I would still deny his existence because he would set a limit to my ego." So that there are some in the world who, instead of saying, "Thy will be done," say, "My will be done. I am supreme. I am my own creator. I am my own savior." And that, in turn, develops an uneasy conscience with a hatred of goodness. Now, when a person is very egotistic, he's guilty. He may not admit his guilt. His guilt is submerged in the lower part of himself. It's bound to come out somehow or other. Here melancholy begins. The first step in melancholy is everything is going to be disaster. He knows that he ought to be judged. He's expecting a very bad judgment, and so he projects a bad judgment outside and predicts everywhere catastrophe. Oh, something terrible will happen. Not only that, he begins to love violence, horror movies, news about crime, dastardly crime. Why? Because when he sees others the victim of violence and punishment, he feels that he is being relieved of his own need of punishment for the crimes and the sins which he himself denies. But more important still, there is a hatred of goodness. One cannot stand virtue. It annoys. He cannot completely destroy the image of God that is within, but he would destroy every semblance of that goodness that was on the outside. Then he thinks that he could restore integrity to himself. And Dostoevsky. Again, coming back to him, sometime I would like to give a whole telecast on this great Russian novelist. Dostoevsky has one of his characters who was a kind of a future communist. His name was Versilov, say, "I really do not know what's the matter with me. I'm split on the inside, and I'm horribly afraid of it. It is just as though one second half were standing beside oneself. There's the sensible and rational self, but the other self is impelled to do something perfectly senseless. And suddenly you find you're doing that very thing. You do not want to do it, but you're doing it. I know a doctor who suddenly began to whistle in church at the father's funeral. I was afraid to go to a funeral today. I was afraid that I might begin to whistle too. I really don't know why I've been haunted that I might come to a bad end. I've been haunted with the thought of that doctor. And then at that moment, he picks up an icon from a table, turns it around in his hands. And he speaks to Sonia. Do you know, Sonia? Here, I've taken up that icon again. Do you know that I have a dreadful longing right now, this very second, to smash it against a stone, against a corner? And I am sure that if I did, it would break into two halves. Split. Like I am. And he took up the icon. He could not stand the sight of goodness. And he threw it into a corner, and it broke in two pieces. Exactly. That hatred of goodness, that terrible bigotry, does not come from a bad man. There are bad men. They steal, they cheat, they violate. But the melancholic, when they reach this stage, they are evil because they are bent on the destruction of the abstract, namely of goodness, morality, and religion, and everything that is fine and noble in life. They would not purify themselves, so they seek to make everything else as rotten as they are. And then there comes the terrible preoccupation with death. Why do they think of death? There's normal fear, certainly. Everyone has that. But they've already been disintegrated. They're split on the inside, and so they sort of long imperceptibly for a final disintegration, which is death. They deny the objective, and so they think of committing suicide. When they get into this despair, every alcoholic thinks of suicide. And they would destroy utterly this objective thing, whatever it is, in order that subjectivity might reign. When a person does anything wrong, he says, why did I do that? Why did I do it? When he's got a religious sense, he will strike his breast and say, mea culpa, mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. Through my fault, through my faults, through my most grievous faults. But when a man has done wrong and is too preoccupied with death and refuses to believe in such a thing called hope, then he begins to pound his breast for the evil that is in there as if he would pound it out, and eventually would reach such a point where he would pound himself to death. There really is such a thing in the modern world as suicidism. Men are concerned too much with death, not with life. And that comes from that unholy despair. Does it? Does it mean that there's no hope? No. These writers whom I have described in this attitude which finds its way into the theater, in poetry, in the press, in philosophy, this attitude is not so far away from something fine and good and noble. There are no hopeless cases. A man will go on enduring anything in life so long as he has a reason for living. When there's no reason for living, then life is cheap. It's not the poor. There's not so much the underprivileged. There's not so much the starving that would give up hope. There's those who have privileges. And where is the hope? The hope is in the fact that men today actually are not going to God by proving his existence from the order of the universe. I taught philosophy for 25 years in a university. Using proofs of this kind are still valid, and they must be used. But the modern man that I have described, at least this particular segment of the modern man, is not going to God that way. He's not going to God through the order in the universe, which argues to an intelligent being. He's going to God through the disorder in his own soul, which needs a Savior. He sees that there is an abyss inside of him, the abyss of misery, and the abyss cries out to the abyss of mercy. And so he can cry out with the psalmist, De profundis clamavi te Domine. Out of the depths have I cried to thee, O Lord. One abyss is the abyss of his own misery and despair, and the other abyss is that of mercy. Where you have misery alone without mercy, you've got despair and melancholy. Where you have mercy without misery, you have arrogance and pride. And the despairing man can put the two together. It is possible. Then there's hope for him. He can start with misery. You know that it's actually possible to find great peace and joy by a succession of disgusts. Sure, there's contradiction inside. Certainly. You see the contradiction, for example, between this bar of life, which is upright, and the threatened bar of death that would cross it. You see, is the contradiction between what he is and what he ought to be. He sees also the contradiction that is inside of him because he's pulled in different directions. He's pulled, for example, back to the past, drags after him. He cannot shed it, he cannot forget it as much as he would. And then on the other hand, he's looking out to the future, distant and away. That's a contradiction. He can start there. He looks inward, sees himself, sometimes like a snake pit. And he looks outward to the things that he loved, to the things that he hated, to the things that crossed him, to the things that pleased him. Now to this contradiction, he now begins to look with hope. Because there's hope when there's mercy. And there's mercy when someone comes to this earth and takes upon himself all of that misery and all of that contradiction, who takes something of the fear and the anxiety and the dread and the despair, puts it into a dark chalice and drinks it, in the Gethsemane. There's mercy, too, when the God becomes man. When he's unfurled by hate, upon a cross then says to the miserable, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. There's hope, too, when the same one takes upon himself something of the loneliness and the bitterness of the atheist, and then shutting out the consolation of divinity, cries, my God, why hast thou abandoned me? There's hope when the same one prays, forgive, and then rises from the dead after all of this misery and desolation and denounces that victory of mercy, not to a virgin as his birth was announced, but announces it to a converted prostitute, to one who was in the depths of melancholy and despair. Why, from that time on, one begins to realize that he never could call, unless he had sinned, he never could call Christ Savior.
People of all faiths recognized Bishop Fulton Sheen as one of the greatest communicators of the 20th century. He was born in El Paso, Illinois, in May of 1896. As a young boy, he knew he wanted to be a priest. He served as an altar boy at St. Mary's Cathedral in Peoria, Illinois. At St. Viator College, his education and debating skills taught him the skills he used throughout his life. His unique ability at being natural and at ease in front of any audience was noted early in his ministry. He was ordained in 1919 and went on to become one of the best-known and greatly loved priests in church history. He wrote 96 books and hundreds of articles and columns. He broadcast numerous radio and TV programs. People from all faiths watched him on television because he spoke to every man. They always waited with joy for his goodbye, his blessing, God love you. It continues to give us joy and memories.
Bye now, and God love you.
Bishop Fulton J. Sheen went to be with the Lord in December of 1979. Fulton J. Sheen, requiescat in pace.
Friends, I don't know exactly how to start this telecast, except maybe to tell you that really there aren't any new things happening in the world. They're just the same old things happening to new peoples. I think that in early history, there happened certain patterns or events which became the model for many subsequent events in history. And of them all, I wonder if the Exodus is not the greatest, and the one that is most applicable to our times. The subject that I'm to talk about today has given me grave concern. That is to say, how it could be presented. I hope it pleases you. I want to tell you that in humanity and through history, many people have common wounds. That's because many people have been exposed to common danger. And there's also a common healing. That's the lesson of the Exodus. Now, what is the pattern of the Exodus? We're only going to speak about the historical Exodus of the Israelites very briefly. But it's our model for today. and for the explanation of contemporary events. In the Exodus, there was first of all an enslaved people. Enslaved or persecuted people, it makes no difference which. Secondly, in the historical Exodus, there was Pharaoh. And thirdly, there was the voice of heaven. Who were the enslaved, persecuted people in the traditional or the pattern Exodus? The Israelites. And anyone who's ever read that story in the scriptures will recall all of the enslaved Jews making bricks for the buildings of Pharaoh. And then Pharaoh even took away the straw and made them still make the same number of bricks per day. Rarely in history have a people been so persecuted. There had to be someone who did the persecuting. Someone who forgot his conscience and ignored it. That was Pharaoh. Pharaoh was face to face with the great man Moses. And Moses spoke the voice of heaven to him. And the words of heaven were, "Let my people go." That's about all we ever hear of that verse. The rest of it is, that they may worship me. That they may worship me. Why release the enslaved? Why free them? For worship, worship, worship. That's the die, that's the pattern, that's the model. The Exodus is not something that has happened, it's something that is happening. Now let me tell you how it is happening in our modern world and how we have to look at events and what is to be the conclusion of these events. To whom is it happening and has happened in our times? To the Jews. To the Christians. To the Negro. What happened in Egypt is happening now. Jews, Old Testament. Christians, New Testament. Negroes, race. Somewhat the same as there. These are the events of our day. Now let me tell you something about each. Because hate has had something to do with each of them. Was it not Lord Byron who said, "We love in haste, we detest in leisure." Love fades. Hate seems to supply its own fuel. Now let's go through the three of them. First, the Jews. The Jews were persecuted in our times just as they were centuries before Christ. Who was the new Pharaoh? Hitler. How many in our day? Did you know that there were 10,000 a day that were thrown into the furnace at Auschwitz? Their skin was used as lampshades. Unspeakable tortures. And in all, let us not forget, in our day, 6 million Jews went to death, to furnaces, and to poison gas chambers. I don't know whether I think I ever told you the story of Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl is one of the world's greatest psychiatrists, a Jew. He was invited to the United States to establish his new school of logotherapy, as he called it. In other words, life must have a meaning. But he had a father back in Vienna. Hitler was just burning the synagogues. Should he go to America? And leave his father to be killed by the Jews, by the Nazis? He went over to the Church of St. Stephen's and prayed for an hour. He received no answer. At least he thought he received no answer. Actually, he did. Because when he came back, he sat down to table with his father. He said to his father, "What's over there in that dresser?" Father said, "A small piece of marble." "Where did you get it?" "Oh," he said, "I was rummaging through the synagogue that Hitler burned, and I picked up this small block of marble. About the only thing that was whole." His son, Dr. Frankl, said, "Any writing on it?" The two of them picked it up. Do you know what it was? What was written there in Hebrew? The beginning of the 4th commandment. Thou shalt honor thy father and thy mother. He stayed with his father. Later went to his death. When we begin to think of inequalities and injustices and the like, let us not forget that this is one of the forms of exodus of our day. Here was one of the Jews who went to death, burned at Auschwitz. He never finished the poem. This young Jewish philosopher, Benjamin Fontaine, never finished it. But he said, "I am speaking as a man to other men with the little that is left in me of man." Now he addresses the Nazis. Like you, I have read papers and books. And I knew nothing about man, although I said I knew, yet not. I did not. I was not a man like you. No one has thrown your little ones into the gutter like little cats whose eyes are not yet open. You have not wandered from town to town, hounded by police. You have not known the cattle trucks and the crime of existing. The day will come when we shall be beyond the land of memory, and I shall be a handful of nettles beneath your feet. When you examine this handful of nettles beneath your feet, in a history lost to you, how wonderful, a history lost to you, only remember that I was innocent. And on that day, like you, I also had a face marked by anger, pity, joy. Simply the face of a man. That is 1/3 of the modern Exodus. Now we come to the second. We have to get the full picture of this world in which we live. So the Old Testament was persecuted in the Jews. New Testament was persecuted in our day, and hundreds of millions in the Christians. I could tell you volumes about this. If you had time and that camera didn't have 1,000 hours of film, I could develop it. Now to tell you some of the persecution of the Christians. When just one people, say the Poles were brought to Siberia by the communists. Who was the pharaoh? Stalin? The communists? Who are the Israelites? The Christians? And as God was saying to the Nazis, let my people go that they may worship me, so he was saying to the Christians, let my people go. The Poles, for example. One man who was in that march, the priest told me that there were 325 priests among the 100,000 and more Poles that were taken to Siberia, and only one of the priests could remember the Our Father. So great were they persecuted. The Orthodox priests. There's a Jew here in New York who was there and who told me this story. He said that he saw a scaffolding. And on top of that scaffolding there were Russian Orthodox priests put. And alongside of them in a great pile were vestments. And they had to take the gold thread out of the vestments. Then they threw the rest of the vestment down. Finally he said there was a pile a couple 100 feet high of all vestments, and they were burned. No food was ever given to those Orthodox priests. After a few days, one after another would topple over. They wouldn't kill them. The modern pharaoh had no conscience. The Protestant ministers. If you want to read a classic, a real classic on this subject, read the book Christ in a Communist Prison by a born Jew, a Protestant minister by the name of Richard Wurmbrand, who in Romania was tied by the modern pharaohs to a cross, tied up there for 4 days, just because he was a man of God, then taken down. And then prisoners were called in to relieve themselves upon him, then dragged back again on the cross. Missionaries in China. Mao was another pharaoh. One man who miraculously escaped it told me that he was 658 days and nights in a prison that was 5 feet long, 3 feet wide, and there was a sloping concrete bench, 180-degree angle. Nobody could rest on it. Crazy designs on the walls to make him mad. So take whatever Christian you can of any single country behind the Iron Curtain. We have had a modern exodus of the Old Testament and of the New. There were over 6 million Jews, over 100 million Christians perished in one way or another. And all the while, heaven was saying to the pharaohs, "Let my people go. Let them go, that they may worship me." And the Exodus goes on. We've had the Old Testament, we've had the New Testament, and now we have race. The Negro. The Negro. They started, become slaves in just a broad kind of way in the year 1444 when a number of them were brought to Lisbon. Then they had their pharaohs. Who were they? Arabs? Muslims? Christians without a conscience? And their own people. Their own people. Because tribe fought tribe. And they felt that one of the ways to conquer tribe was to sell them into slavery. And whoever the pharaohs were, the persecution went on. And how many in all? Well, there have been various estimates made. The extreme number was 100 million slaves were taken out of Africa. There is sufficient evidence to prove that during certain years about only 1/3 of them ever got here. They died because of the cruelty of the galley slaves. Vain attempt to reconcile biblical teaching with slavery, which could not be done. So they joined what? They joined the Jews. They joined the Christians. I have here a few advertisements which may interest you. Negroes for sale. This is taken from the New Orleans Bee for the Civil War. A Negro woman, 24 years of age, and her 2 children, one 8 and the other 3 years of age, said Negroes will be sold separately or together as desired. The woman is a good seamstress. She will be sold low for cash or exchanged for groceries. Apply to Matthew Bliss, New Orleans Bee. A girl of 4 would bring her $387. Boy of 4, about $450. Girl of 7, $800 in an auction in 1855. And these people that were enslaved, they sang songs. Where did they come from? They came from the Exodus. They came from the story of the Old Testament. And they sang songs. And tell old Pharaoh, let my people go. And the Negro spirituals